Welcome to the Pretty Powerful Podcast, where powerful women are interviewed every week to share real inspiring stories and incredible insight to help women or anyone break the barriers, be a part of innovation, shatter the glass ceiling, and dominate to the top of their sport, industry, or life's mission. Join us as we celebrate exceptional women and step into our power. And now, here's your host, Angela Gennari.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Pretty Powerful Podcast. My name is Angela Gennari, and today I'm here with Bethany Corbin. Hi, Bethany.
Hi, Angela. Thank you so much for having me.
My pleasure. So Bethany is an award-winning attorney and top voice at the intersection of women's health and technology. She is the managing partner of Women's Health Innovation Consulting and the co-founder and CEO of FemInnovation. Through her companies, Bethany helps unite the women's health ecosystem to drive meaningful and sustainable change in the women's health and Femtech industries. So cool. So I'm going to start by asking, what led you to focus on your career in women's health and Femtech?
Yeah, it's actually an interesting journey. So I started my legal career in financial services and litigation. So something totally different
Yes.
than healthcare at all. But I'd always had a passion for healthcare because my mom actually has an incurable disease, which she got diagnosed with when I was, she got the symptoms when I was about 8 years old. And it took another 7 to 8 years for her to get diagnosed. So we had a long and kind of complicated history with medical gaslighting as a child and seeing the different inner workings of the healthcare system in the US. And so I've always had that passion for healthcare. I went and, like any other person, right, decided to make money, focus my legal career in big law. And then very unexpectedly had my own women's health issue at the height of the pandemic. Unexpectedly, I was at a doctor's office, and just for my annual physical, I had no real symptoms. I did have symptoms, but I had written them off like many women do. And so we're at the end of the exam, and she asked me if I'm pregnant. And I just laugh. I'm like, no, there's no chance I'm pregnant. And then she gets out the tape measure, and it starts to dawn on me that there's something going on in my stomach. Pelvic region, if you have a tape measure. And it turned out that I had massive fibroids to the point where I was the equivalent of 6 months pregnant, and they were starting to crush my internal organs. So I now was then thrust into that role of being a patient, navigating the healthcare system on my own, no longer being an advocate, but having to actually do all the research, check out all the treatment options. And in that, I learned that 80% of women are going to have fibroids during their lifetime.
Wow.
And it caused me to think, well, if 80% of men had tumors on their reproductive organs, we would have a pill for this. This would be easily treated, and it wouldn't be a problem. And instead, I had to have a 7-hour plus surgery at the Mayo Clinic, which is longer than a heart transplant surgery. So I could not believe it. And I said, we've got to do better for women. And so I actually completely pivoted my career into being a voice of change for women's health.
Wow, that is an unbelievable story. And thank God you just happened to be there getting your checkup, because we're bad at acknowledging symptoms. We're like, it'll go away. That little squeak, that crack, that whatever, it'll be fine.
Right. And we're so often taught, that it's not anything to worry about, right? I thought I was just getting fat and, I was eating poorly. And, the only real symptom I had is, I would get full quickly. So I'd kind of have some nausea after eating. And then when I would lay down to do ab exercises and I'd lay on the floor, it felt like something was there. But of course, right, we had to minimize it. So I'm like, oh, it's probably a hernia or something, not that important. Not, hey, this is a giant tumor in my stomach.
Oh my gosh. Wow. Wow, that's incredible. So okay. So then you go through this intense surgery. I mean, 7 hours, that's intense. Pretty intense. So then you decide to pivot your whole career. So what does that look like? Tell me what challenges you had to kind of face at that point, because I mean, you're already, you're moving full on into one career and now you're pivoting.
Yeah, exactly. It's tough. Whenever I first decided to be a healthcare attorney, it was really interesting because I thought, great, I'm just going to switch fields, right? The law is the law, right? The skills that I have should be easily transferable. I can read a case in financial services. I can easily read one in healthcare. And what I found was that actually nobody would hire me as a healthcare attorney, even
Really?
though I had the perfect pedigree that you would look for, right? I had great law school. I was top of my class. I was on Law Review Journal, right? I had big law experience. I had a really coveted DC circuit clerkship. And I thought getting a job is going to be easy. And I don't want to be in financial services anymore, in litigation. I want to do healthcare. So that should be really easy transition. I applied and I applied and I applied. And every time what I heard was, you need healthcare specific experience in the legal field in order to be a healthcare attorney. And I couldn't understand why. And it
Hmm.
turns out, our healthcare system is very complex, especially from a fraud and abuse side. And there's a lot of healthcare specific information and topics that they want you to know. So what I actually ended up having to do is I got a job in a large law firm in DC, and I worked in their telecommunications and technology and media practice group. And they had a healthcare group as well. And I went and I reached out to the healthcare partners and I said, hey, I'm really interested in working in what you're doing. I don't have any healthcare experience. I've got, 4 or 5 years of legal experience, though. If there's any overflow work that your team needs, please come and talk to me. I'd love to help. And it was great because I also, at the same time, decided to get my LLM, which, for those who aren't familiar, is kind of the next step above a JD degree. I got my LLM while I was working in healthcare law as well. So that kind of combination was great because the healthcare partners did reach out to me. And it's funny because I ended up doing maybe 10% of the work for my hired practice group. And then the other 90% I was doing in intellectual property and healthcare and working with those other diverse groups, which was great. So that's kind of how I transitioned and dealt with the barrier of the fact that I really didn't have a lot of healthcare specific expertise. So I ended up having to do another degree program while I worked, starting out in a practice area that maybe I wasn't as passionate about, and doing some extra work on the side until I was fully integrated into that healthcare group.
Wow, that is incredible tenacity. I mean, to to take on all of that, for a specific, because you were so focused on your mission, which was
Yep.
ultimately to get into this femtech space, right? To be a
Uh,
healthcare advocate. Wow. So okay, so then, so as you get into this new segment of healthcare, tell me what that looks like. What is women's health in law? Like how do the two coincide, and where does that collision happen?
yeah, it's so interesting because until 2016, the term femtech did not even exist.
Really?
Um, so when I went to law school, this field did not even have a name.
Hmm.
So it was really interesting, kind of the more I read up and got into femtech. For me, I was at Big Law at that time, and so we were dealing a lot with, kind of the more traditional aspects of healthcare, like managed care, insurance, pharmacy benefit management, right? Those kind of not so fun
Yeah.
aspects of healthcare where you're working with the large healthcare institutions. And that's not at all what femtech is. So femtech itself is more working with startups and helping them bring their products to life. And so after I kind of got that healthcare knowledge and really realized that femtech was where I wanted to focus, I actually had to switch law firms and go to a much smaller law firm that could cater to those startup clients. And so I went to a firm that focused exclusively on digital health innovation. And by that point in time, gosh, I had been an attorney 7 or 8 years and
Mhm.
had healthcare background, right? Had all this great background. I went there and it was very interesting. I remember crying the first week on the job because I said, oh my God, I know how to do nothing. Because
Wow.
right, all the work that they did for startups was a complete 180 to the work that you're doing for the larger healthcare organizations. And so I had to learn all about telehealth, digital health, crazy corporate structures for telehealth companies, all things that I didn't know how to do, how to form companies, what it looks like on the IP side. And so for somebody who never had to deal with that before, that was an entirely new learning curve for me. And I'm glad I stuck it out because I learned a lot. And that allowed me to start building a practice with femtech companies where I was able to work with them, help them bring their products to life faster, get those products to the market, and kind of navigate all the different regulatory hurdles that they experienced, especially data privacy and kind of that post-Roe world.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Wow, that's so interesting. So, I look at when you were talking about how you had come from big law and gone into, the more, agile startup community. It's so interesting because I've spent most of my career on the startup side. And every time we hire somebody from a big corporation, and I'm like, oh, they're going to bring so much experience and they're going to bring so much knowledge, and they're going to really have that ability to make our company seem big. And it's the opposite. They come
Yes.
in and they're helpless. They're like,
Yes.
there's not enough structure. There's not enough, like, somebody, who do I delegate to? You delegate to nobody.
Nobody.
Figure
Oh
it
my
out.
gosh. It's so funny you mentioned that because, I had 7, 8 years of law experience. I was next in line for partner at my large law
Wow.
firm. And when I took a step, when I took the smaller job, I actually had to take a temporary decrease in title because they were telling me that it was going to be so different from anything I had ever worked on that they didn't want to set me up for failure by bringing me on as, senior counsel or something like that without giving me a ramp up period. And so
Mhm.
that was intimidating. I'm like, man, am I actually taking a demotion to go and do this job and do something that I think I might be really passionate about? And technically I did for, for 4 or 5 months, take that demotion. And I'm glad I did because I learned so much kind of on that ramp up period. But yeah, no, it was interesting that you say that because 100% people who are not used to working in the startup world, they have a really hard time transitioning into the fast-paced environment and kind of the all hands on deck environment.
Oh yeah, yeah. It's blown up in our face more than once. And even when you
Yeah.
try, like, I have a lot of respect for them saying, "Hey, we're gonna not put you in and set you up for failure." I have a
Yeah.
lot of respect for that because, you hire somebody and you're like, "I'm gonna do this reach, and I'm gonna bring somebody in from big law, and they're gonna be, our director of whatever, whatever," and then it ends up being a disaster. And that has happened to us for the same reasons. We've brought somebody in from a big company. We thought they'll be able to, transfer their knowledge and expertise into
Um,
what we do. And it has crashed and burned badly.
yeah.
And that ramp up period is really important because how business is done is how it's different. I mean, it's everything's different.
Well, yeah, right. And you go from a law firm, where the partner is your quote unquote client, right? And they tell
Right.
you what to do, and you always have somebody looking at your work before it goes out the door, to then
Yeah.
a startup where you have to be entirely self-sufficient because everybody else is doing 10 million things and they don't have time to double and triple check you.
Yes, yes, yes. So, okay, this is so fascinating. So then you go into the startup world. So talk to me a little bit more about Femtech. Like, what companies are out there? Like, how are companies out there getting women's needs met when it comes to health and technology?
Yeah, it's a great question. So femtech itself actually does not have a universal definition. And at its most basic, it just means female health technology or female technology.
Okay.
In terms of companies, so it has grown exponentially. As I mentioned, in 2016, it was first coined by Ida Tin, who is the founder of Clue, which a lot of people know, right? It's kind of your period and ovulation tracking app. And since then, we have grown to over 1,800 companies in the femtech industry. We passed the $1 billion funding mark back in 2021. And we're serving an industry that's projected to be worth, gosh, $1.186 trillion by 2030 for the women's health industry. So it's a huge potential. And I would say, for the first several years of femtech, really until the last 2 years, a lot of the products on the market were really focused on kind of reproductive health care for women. And so you would see a lot of period tracking apps, fertility apps, ovulation tracking apps, maternal care apps as well. We started to see some that not only allowed women to track kind of their pregnancy symptoms, but also focused on kind of that postpartum period as well, or the fourth trimester. So that kind of had a lot of market saturation at first, partly because those are the easiest apps to kind of produce and get to market quickly and get a return on that investment.
Right.
Now, though, in the last 2 years, since about 2022, what we've started to see is growth in the different areas of women's health that are being addressed. So menopause has been one that's really proliferated. We're seeing a lot of invention now and investment in menopause. We're seeing longevity and more elderly care opportunities come to the market on kind of apps and software and wearables for that. In
Wow.
addition, cancers are getting more and more interest in treatment. So breast cancer, uterine cancer, and ovarian cancer, I would say, are the three that we're starting to see a lot of innovation in. We've also seen innovation too in kind of, routine products, right? Like pads and tampons, and the different kind of cups that you can use, and what is, the different types of IUDs. What does that look like? How is that being reinvented? We're starting to see some really cool inventions there. And, for instance, one company just did a spiral tampon that can actually enhance, the blood collection as well. So we're seeing kind of a range of products, whether they're actual tangible consumer goods or they're more kind of on the apps and wearables and software side. And I would say, the most recent numbers that I have say about 52.8% of the products in Femtech have some type of a software or digital health component to them.
Wow. So we're looking at a lot of things that I feel like have moved beyond the mom thing, right? Because they all want to take care of moms, right? But we're also women, and not all women are moms, right? And so
exactly. It's interesting. No, it's just interesting you say that, because I was on a webinar earlier today where we talked about the ways in which some of the early femtech companies actually made erroneous assumptions about what women wanted in their femtech products. And they made that exact assumption, right? That all women want to be mothers. Right. And so some of the initial versions of these products that you saw on the market actually would only allow you to track your period if you were trying to get pregnant or things like that. So it had a lot of kind of misaligned assumptions with the user base. A lot of those have worked out now, but it's interesting when you look back at kind of the origins.
Yeah, well, because usually, in the past, I feel like women's health has only been a priority as far as it has been, in reproductive areas,
Exactly.
that, we want to make sure we have healthy babies, but, the women themselves, other than reproductive, we have other needs. So,
right. And 100% of women go through menopause,
yes.
And so you kind of had that, perception, right, that women's health doesn't matter after you've gone through menopause because of the focus on reproductive health. And so it's nice to see that paradigm shift a bit and say, no, every stage of women's healthcare matters. And so that's what we're starting to see now with Femtech.
Very interesting. So are you seeing a lot of companies that are talking about hormone imbalances? Because I'm hearing a lot more about that lately.
Yeah, there's a lot of companies out there dealing with hormone imbalances, hot flashes, and also things like non-hormonal birth control as well. That's gotten a lot of attention. So we are seeing a lot more kind of on the hormonal side. And I would say that's, kind of depending on the application in which it's used, can either fall into reproductive or non-reproductive healthcare. So it kind of falls on both sides of that. But yes, definitely seeing some big innovations there. And we're also seeing large innovations in how employer groups are using Femtech products now or making them available to their employees. That's something you didn't really have a couple of years ago. And now a lot of different employer groups are trying to say, okay, well, what menopause solution can we get for our employees, or what type of, fertility care or support can we provide to individuals who do want to get pregnant? So we're seeing a lot of that in the employer context as well, which is really interesting and kind of a new development.
Absolutely. So as an attorney, I'm sure you have to have a say in a lot of what's created out there, in terms of as founders are building their companies and they're creating their business models. What would you say are the top mistakes Femtech or digital health founders make?
Yeah, it's interesting, right? That's one of my most favorite parts of the job, is that I actually get to see a lot of these inventions before they get to market and kind of do that legal risk analysis. So it's really cool to see these products as they're being built. But I would say that there's a couple of really key areas that Femtech founders in particular get caught up in.
Okay.
The first is definitely, and this one's not necessarily specific to Femtech, but it has to do with your name, and what you want that business name to be. A lot of founders don't realize that you need to do a trademark search to make sure that you're not infringing on somebody else's business name. And then and then B, right, that the states, actually, depending on which state you're forming in, they have certain requirements about what you can or cannot say in your name and how you can be misleading, and that type of thing. So you also have to check state requirements. So I found that that's, pretty common for most Femtech founders to not really understand. The other thing that's a bit unique to Femtech has to do with data privacy. So I am a data privacy attorney as well by background. I have some data privacy certifications, and this became hugely important after the Dobbs decision came out in the US, because now we have an environment in which there's actually been a large loss of consumer trust in Femtech products because they're not sure how those companies are using and disclosing their data downstream and whether or not that might actually be used against them. So I would say a lot of the common challenges I deal with Femtech companies have to do with, well, how can we make our product privacy centric? How can we make sure that we're not using or disclosing data downstream in a way that's going to be harmful to patients? What disclosures do we need in case somebody does input abortion data or reproductive health data that could potentially be used against them? How do we handle hackers, right? Cyber insurance. And so that entire data privacy landscape is really, really challenging in Femtech right now. And so we've seen a lot of creative solutions come up. We even deal with things as simple as, where should I be storing that data, right? Because some states have better reproductive health care laws right now than others. What am I allowed to say or not say? So that's been a big one for Femtech. And then I would say the third one that we deal with a lot of times has to do with how you divide equity in the company. We have Femtech's really unique in that more than 70% of founders in Femtech are female. And that's compared to maybe 20% in total for our startup company. So that's great. But we also deal with female founders who don't necessarily want to have the hard conversations up front about how you're going to divide equity and what that looks like and how you're valuing each other's contributions. And then that can unfortunately lead to a lot of unfortunate situations down the line where somebody feels like it's not working out, right? Then you have co-founder breakups. So I do a lot of consultation with female founders in particular about having those hard conversations up front and deciding how you're going to divide that equity, what that looks like in terms of the legal documents and the legal language, and making sure they get it right at the outset instead of pushing those conversations for a later date.
So I'm just going to ask this question because I'm curious. Do you find that female founders tend to be a little bit more generous when it comes to ownership and not as keen on, intellectual property?
Yes, I do. And I find, when it comes to ownership, and this happens, outside Femtech as well, right? But a default of we're just going to split everything equally. And I see that a lot less frequently with the male founders that I work with who are very intentional about saying, no, my contribution is this, right? Your contribution is technically worth less than that, right? Here's the fun mathematical way we're going to divide that. And in a lot of the conversations I have with Femtech founders, it's more like, oh no, we just want to divide everything equally, right? We haven't really decided.
We all contribute in our own way.
We all contribute. Exactly. And I have to force them and I say, no, that's a great starting place, but no, I want you to go back and I want you to talk to each other and to think separately about what exactly it is you're bringing to the table and how you envision that evolving over time and what you would put, for a monetary contribution to that. And then we're going to come back and we're going to have the hard conversation because you're not just going to shrug your shoulders and say equal.
Yeah, I know. I was curious because that's women tend to be by default community minded. We are community minded. We want everybody to be happy. We want everybody to have their fair share. And that is our, nurturing part of us. But I have talked more female founders out of giving away ownership.
Yes.
I feel like I'm I actually randomly met a woman at a restaurant at one point, and she was a nurse and she came up with this great idea on something that they were doing during the pandemic. And so anyway, they were working with COVID and so she had a girl with her. And this girl was her friend, and they're telling me about their business. And so this woman, the one I was mainly talking to, had done all of the work, all of the investment, single mother, done all this stuff. She's working a full-time job to support launching this part-time venture that she had started. And so she had been operating and she had a little, a small amount of success at this point. And she was like, well, I'm going to bring her in as my partner. I'm like, wait, what? Why? Why does she need to be your partner? And she's like, well, we're friends and she's going to help me do certain things. And I'm like, well, what is her monetary investment? Well, she's not making a monetary investment. Well, what is her time? And like, tell me exactly what earned her partnership status, because she sounds like an employee or a contractor. And I was like, hire her as an independent contractor. Why do you need to give her ownership? And she's like, well, I just feel like since she's going to be, contributing. And I'm like, no, no, no. That means she keeps her job if she contributes. If she's contributing, that means she gets to keep the job, or she gets to be paid for her services. It doesn't mean she gets to be ownership, have ownership of the company. But it's an interesting conversation. And so many of those happen where they feel like, well, it's the right thing to do. Well, we all contribute in our own way. Well, we all bring something different to the table. Do you really bring something different to the table? The only people who should be your partners are the ones who bring something unique to the table that you do not have the skill set for and cannot hire for at a comparable rate. And that's it.
Exactly. Oh my gosh, 100%. And it's interesting, right? Because some founders don't realize that investors are going to ask about this, right? They're going to ask what you're each bringing to the table and why you decided to divide equity that way. And you can't just shrug your shoulders and say, well, we're all contributing.
Yeah.
Right? You have to know each person's value add, as you said, Angela, and really understand what you bring to that table and why that's something you can't just hire, an outside contractor to do.
Yeah, exactly. So I was just curious about that. So sorry to sidebar on that, but I was just very curious. So when you're creating what we call a minimum viable business model, right? So what do you think is the lawyer's role? How does an attorney help out with that?
Yeah, it's interesting because if you ask a startup, they will say, "Oh, I don't need an attorney for that."
Yeah.
And so in their mind, we don't help out. That is not recommended for a lot of different reasons.
Right.
In Femtech, for instance, there are some different business models that I have seen Femtech founders use that are actually wrong or that can cause legal risk down the line. And they don't realize it because sometimes it can be something that is very specific to healthcare that would otherwise be permissible in any other industry that you're doing it in. But our healthcare laws are very stringent in certain circumstances, and founders don't necessarily realize that. So they say, well, I saw this model work in financial services, right? Or in retail or in real estate. And so therefore, I'm going to create it here in healthcare. And they can get in a lot of trouble of that, especially whenever we're talking about things like fraud, waste, and abuse, or how you're setting up a telehealth company to be able to attract investment, given our corporate practice of medicine laws. So I think that there's a lot that founders assume they know, which they unfortunately don't know. And really in the MVP product, what you want your lawyer to be doing is to advise you on if that's going to be an acceptable and an advisable structure before you go and create it. And what I mean by that, right, is if somebody comes to me and they say, well, I'm going to build a telehealth company for women's healthcare, and we're going to create a Delaware C Corp and hire all the doctors through that and provide care, right, across the United States, I'm going to say, that's wrong. What you really need is this specific MSOPC model to get around the different healthcare laws that we have. And you're going to need clinicians licensed in all 50 states. And then you're going to have to set up 5 to 6 practices and foreign register them, and that's kind of really goes into your MVP and how you're going to structure your company and your offerings. And so you unfortunately don't know what you don't know. So I always recommend bringing in a lawyer at the outset and having that conversation with them and saying, here's what I want to do. Here's how I'm proposing to do it. What do you see are the risks to this? And the lawyer, it doesn't have to be something where you're paying thousands and thousands of dollars to get their insight. It can be an hour-long call and you pay their hourly rate and you give them the overview and they're able to issue spot for you and they can give you a high level, yeah, I think that's okay. Or here's the likely risks that you're going to run into. Here's the high risk areas that you should consider mitigating first. And then you can use that when building out your MVP and make those strategic shifts early versus building out that MVP and trying to go to market. And then you get a bunch of letters from government regulatory agencies that say that you're operating improperly or without proper consents and licenses. So I really think our role at the MVP stage is advisory, in that we're able to kind of tell you what, A, if your model is going to work, from a legal perspective, but B, what we've also seen work similarly, right? Because you're probably doing something that we have seen others try to do at some point in time or have done something similar. And we can advise you on whether that worked out for them, right? Or what we saw as kind of their pain points that you might run into. So you can also get kind of that really cool insight that you might not otherwise get if you're just out there trying to do it on your own.
Absolutely. Yeah, I'm a big proponent of bringing the right people with the right expertise early on.
Yeah.
Even on things like trademarks, like you were saying earlier, it's one thing to do a quick online Google search for, hey, does Titan Global Enterprises exist anywhere? And I can be like, nope, and it's also not okay to just think, if I can register it in the state, it must be available. Nope, that's not
Nope.
it. So, um, yeah,
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, I'm a lawyer, right? But I even have my own trademark attorney because I don't do in-depth work in that space. And I want somebody who's going to be an expert in that area of the law. So I have my own trademark attorney who does that. Or if I get office actions and I say, hey, you know what? Yeah, I could probably respond to this, but let me ask his strategy. Oh, it's different than what I would have done. Let's go with what he said. Like
yeah.
I don't want to create problems for myself.
Yeah, well, and avoiding legal consultations early on usually lead to much more expensive legal consultations
Yes.
later.
100%. That was, before I kind of launched out on my own with FemInnovation and Women's Health Innovation Consulting. And I worked at a smaller firm. We still had to turn clients away because they didn't have enough funds, to be able to afford our services. And so we turned them away and they would come back a year or two later. And I just recall going through, what they were doing and that, what they had done in that interim period. And I would half the time have to say, this is great, but you did XYZ wrong, and it's going to cost you twice as much now versus if you had been able to hire an attorney at the outset. And it was just heartbreaking because that happens, unfortunately, all the time for startup founders.
Yeah,
And the other thing that I would say that's really interesting is when I launched out on my own, I never thought I would have to convince anybody about the merits of getting legal counsel.
yeah,
I thought it would be very straightforward, like, yes, we know we need legal,
yeah,
right? I
yeah,
didn't feel like I'd ever have to sell it. And it's interesting because now with startup companies, right, when you have funding that's so tight and you have to vie for a portion of that funding, you have to explain to them why legal matters and why it's important for them to do the consults up front. So there's actually a lot more selling of legal services than I ever thought there would be in this
yeah,
field.
yeah. That's very interesting. All right, so how would you say femtech is trending now? Where do you feel like we're looking towards the future of femtech?
I am so excited for the future of femtech, I have to say. I think it's an industry where, yeah, we have some problems, we have some concerns, especially post Dobbs and regaining consumer trust. But I think it's
So
also an industry.
just
Oh,
to cut you off real quick, just for our audience, can you
yeah.
explain what the Dobbs decision was?
Yeah, of course. So the Dobbs decision was essentially the Supreme Court decision that came down that overturned Roe versus Wade. And Roe versus Wade was the decision that gave women the federally protected right to get an abortion. And so when Dobbs came down, it returned that decision to the states. So now we have a framework for abortion that's very state specific. And really how that impacted femtech was the fact that now we had a lot of those trigger laws go into effect, meaning that they were laws that were on the books before the Roe versus Wade decision that then automatically went back into effect. And a lot of them either severely restricted or completely banned abortions in certain states. And so because of that, we now have certain states that outlaw or severely limit the time frame in which a woman can get an abortion. And in those states, there's a huge concern that the data that a woman has could be used against her in like a law enforcement proceeding or a court action to show that she had an illegal abortion. And when that happened, you probably remember that there were tons of news articles that came out that said, delete your period tracking apps, right? Delete your femtech apps. That data is going to be used against you. So that's still kind of the environment in which we're navigating for femtech and how these companies need to rebuild trust in their data protection and security policies and procedures. So that's kind of, the landscape that we're navigating now. But I think there's so much potential because femtech is really, for the first time, giving a unified language to women's empowerment and really helping women kind of understand their bodies and their healthcare decisions and give them kind of the power to actually be able to talk about it in a more public space for conversations that were traditionally held, quietly or considered taboo. So I'm really excited for where we're going. I think we're going to continue to see advancements in the spaces of longevity, senior care, autoimmune diseases, and cancer. Those are the ones I'm really interested in seeing kind of how those products develop.
Yeah.
Historically, they've gotten a bit less funding because obviously those are the ones that are going to take longer to get to market because you have to go through, the FDA approval process and you have to have a lot more money to do the clinical trials. So those are taking longer to get to market, but we're starting to see more of an interest from investors and investment in the women's healthcare field there. So I think that's very positive. The other thing that we have too for future of femtech is just the need to get more investment in this space, honestly. Women's health gets, of all of the healthcare research and development dollars, 4%
Wow.
of. And if you
Really?
break that down further, femtech gets probably about 2% of all venture capital dollars. And that's it for women's healthcare, despite the fact that we are 50% of the population.
That's a,
And when you look at even NIH funding, things like that, right, it's still around kind of the 4% mark for women's healthcare.
hmm.
A lot of founders, I would say almost 100% of founders that I've talked to and worked with have difficulty getting males to understand why this is an important industry. And because the venture capital landscape is so heavily male dominated, it's very difficult to get money and to get funding. So
Yeah.
I think that's kind of our next challenge on the horizon. I think we have a huge potential. I think we just have to find a way to kind of break down that barrier in how we talk about femtech to the male investors and get more money.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Well, and we just need more of these big, investment firms to understand the value of what we're trying to do with women in particular.
Exactly. And to not squirm whenever they talk about periods or the pregnancy process or things like
Right.
that.
Absolutely. So very inspiring, everything that you're doing, but who inspires you?
Oh my goodness. It's it's really interesting. I have had one source of inspiration that's really been constant. And it's not who anybody would expect. And probably somebody nobody, very few people I've heard of. But
Mhm.
since I was a little kid, I have been so inspired by Araceli Segarra, who is a mountain climber. And she was just, one of the first people to, of her race to really summit Mount Everest, and all of these other, huge cliffs and peaks. And so I've always been really inspired by her story about, how she was the first woman to do it, how she was able to really overcome those barriers in her life that were trying to, stop her, preclude her from getting to where she was in her lifetime. I actually had the chance to meet her whenever I was 7 or 8 years
That's
old.
cool.
Yeah, I got a signed Everest book from her. And that's just always been kind of a source of inspiration for me to say, you know what, don't give up. You're gonna have roadblocks. It's not going to be easy. It's not meant to be easy. And so as you get those roadblocks, think about what they're trying to teach you. Think about how you might be able to overcome them or how you might have to pivot. Because, nobody's journey is going to be, linear. It looks more like a child's cartoon drawing than a straight line. And so that's always been something that's been really powerful and inspiring to me, is just watching her and how she overcame those barriers and really what that looks like as well whenever you apply it into your own life when you're not a mountain climber, right, or a rock climber, or doing something to that extreme. But those lessons are still very powerful.
Absolutely. That's awesome. So in our lives as women, we give away our power all the time. And
Yeah.
I feel like, whether it's, giving somebody else credit, and we were just talking about this in terms of like everybody gets ownership. That's not okay. But can you tell me about a time that you gave your power away and then maybe another time where you stepped into your power as a woman?
Yeah, it happens so frequently. And I will say this has been something I've had to learn over time about kind of how to stand up for myself. Because, right, I am a woman, right? And I'm somebody who confrontation is not really fun for me, even though I am a lawyer.
Right.
And so for example, one instance was when I was working as a law professor, I was actually being taken advantage of in the role. I was a new law professor. And I was also overseeing a Master of Studies in Law program. And it was very interesting because the faculty members were actually going, to the dean on my behalf and saying, this is way too much for one person to take on. You would never ask, any other entry-level law professor to do everything that you've asked her to do, with teaching.
Wow.
Yeah, with teaching JD courses, teaching MSL courses, and running an MSL program. You would never ask that of anybody else. And unfortunately, there were funding constraints at the university at that time. They didn't have a chance to hire anybody else. And it just came to the point where I completely burned out, from all of the work that was happening, from not being able to stick up for myself. And I remember going into the dean's office and basically telling her that I was quitting because there wasn't a way for me to do this job to my standards of excellence. And I had been asking as well for support, and I needed support, and I, was not, unfortunately, able to get any. And so I just remember during that conversation in which I resigned, and her telling me that she was so disappointed in me, and that, that I was making a huge mistake and I was letting the entire university down, and how could I do that? And, this was just terrible and unprofessional of me not to stay on and complete out, all of these responsibilities that really never should have been placed on me. And I remember just sitting there, and I was so burned out. And I did think, what? Yeah, she's right. This is my fault. Maybe I am not professional. Maybe this is, something that's wrong with me. And I remember leaving that meeting and feeling really demoralized and, not having stood up for myself. And, it's funny because I got home and I was talking to my dad about it. He's like, so why'd you sit there and take it? I'm like,
Yeah.
That's a great question. Why did I sit there and take it?
Yeah. Yeah.
And why didn't I stand up for myself? And to this day, I absolutely regret not standing up for myself and kind of giving away that power and basically saying, yeah, you know what, I'm gonna allow you to treat me this way and to abuse me, in a way that should never have happened for somebody who was new and in my situation and my shoes. So that's definitely one where I gave the power away and, didn't stand up for myself in a way that I absolutely should have. And I absolutely hate that to this day.
Mhm.
One where I kind of took the power back. So that was, there's a couple of interesting scenarios there, but the one I would say, is that I was actually a victim of domestic abuse. And this was in college. And I was dating a fantastic guy, or so I had thought. And he had ended up, hitting me one night, and I called the cops, and I ended up pressing charges and going through the entire criminal procedure and the process there, and really kind of taking back ownership of that narrative and saying, you know what, I'm not going to be a victim. I'm not going to allow him to do this to somebody else, and really taking that power back, not only through the criminal justice system, but also the university's honor council, and really pursuing it there as well, even though it was one of the most difficult times in my life. And I, kind of at the time, you kind of hate yourself for doing it, but it's the right thing to do because he could absolutely do this to somebody else in the future. So that was one in which I was able to really kind of step into that power. It may not have been something I wanted to do, but it's something I knew that for me, I needed to do in order to protect other women.
Yeah, absolutely. Good for you for doing that, even if it's, because I mean, there was a time when, I was in an abusive marriage, and everybody's like, why didn't you call the police? And it's like, you have 100 excuses. Well,
Yeah.
because I was protecting his daughters, I was protecting this, I was doing this. And at the end of the day, all it meant is he gets to go out and do this again to somebody else. Right. And so, kudos to you for taking a stand and saying, no, this is going on record, and I'm going to have a voice in this, and I'm not going to, cower and let this just, go to the wayside, which is what most abusers assume will happen. So,
Yeah, no, and it's really difficult, right? I mean, that was the hardest time period of my life because I didn't want to have to do that.
yeah.
I hated having to do it. Of course, you have all the emotions of still, being in love with somebody who had done that to you. And there's just knowing that you kind of had this broader responsibility, was really kind of what powered me through. But like you, I got all the questions from friends and family. Well, why'd you stay in that for so long, right? Why didn't you leave? Why didn't you just kick his ass?
Yeah. Exactly. Exactly. I can totally relate. So, well, so what advice would you give to your 18-year-old self?
Yeah, one of the key pieces of advice I think I would say is you don't have to have it all figured out. I
Yes.
was I was that person who at 18, I was like, great, this is my life. It is totally planned out. I'm going to go to college. I'm going to be a doctor, right? I'm going to do this kind of residency and this type of fellowship.
Yeah.
And I'm going to have 2 kids, right? And I'm going to get married at this age and it's going to be perfect. And I will say none of that happened. And I always, and it's sad, right? Because of course, right, you're a little cocky 18-year-old. And so you think like, oh, that person doesn't have their life figured out. I kind of look down on them. And I think that they're actually doing it a lot better than what I did, where they took the time to allow themselves to explore the different fields that were available to them. Maybe they took a gap year and tried to figure it out and take that time off. I'm so envious now, right? Looking back, and I said, wow, they had time to really explore what they were interested in. I marched straight ahead on this path of going through college super fast and law school super fast and going into an industry that I had no passion for, and then having to pivot and do another degree and find out what I was passionate about later on in life, when maybe if I had allowed myself more flexibility, especially in my early stages in college, to try out different courses or not try to take 10 science classes in one semester and kill myself. Maybe that would have allowed me to realize I was interested in healthcare from a career perspective a lot sooner. So I would tell myself, slow down. It's okay to not know what you want to do. You shouldn't know what you want to do at this stage, and to just be open to the other possibilities that might come along, because an industry like Femtech may not exist when you go to college or law school, but kind of stay abreast of what's happening and what's changing, and allow yourself to be passionate about things and allow that passion to change and grow with you.
Absolutely. Amen to that. So, Bethany, this has been a really great conversation. I've enjoyed everything we've talked about, and I think our audience has really learned a ton. I know I have learned a ton. This has been really insightful. I mean, there was so much that I have learned from you about Femtech and the industry and what's out there in the future of Femtech. But one last question that I have for you: what do you wish more people knew?
I wish more people honestly knew about Femtech. Because there has been a recent survey that shows like 86% of women have never heard of Femtech. And I absolutely believe that, because it is new, but women's health isn't something that we talk about.
Right.
And so because of that, and because of the censorship that we have with Facebook and Instagram and online social media channels, there's actually no good way for Femtech companies to get the news out about their products to consumers. And so a lot of women don't even realize that these products are being developed for them in order to know, like, yeah, I should be buying this, in order to then tell investors to increase funding that way. So it's this huge catch-22 that we have. And I think, going forward, we need to find a way in which to get the consumer population more knowledgeable and involved, not only in Femtech, but about women's health in general from an early age, so that we can stop seeing these as taboo topics that can't be discussed online or in public, and rather see them as, this is women's healthcare. This is going to benefit everyone. And we need to start putting dollars and resources into making it accessible. So I do wish more people knew about Femtech. Obviously it's growing industry. It's a great industry. It has its faults like any other industry does, but the more that we can get the information out there, the better off we're going to be long-term for women's health. Absolutely.
And, I look at it as an infant industry. We're in infant stages. And I mean, look at Bitcoin, look at the internet, everybody has had their challenges when you're kind of starting out and figuring out, how to walk. And but I think Femtech has a great future, and I'm really excited about what you're doing and all the work that you're putting in. So thank you for everything that you're doing out there to increase awareness and to advocate for women in health.
Oh, thank you, Angela. No, I appreciate the opportunity to come on your show and to spread that awareness. So thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Well, guys, you can check out Bethany Corbin on prettypowerfulpodcast.com. All of her information will be there. And then how else can they find you, Bethany?
Yeah, so I'm very active on LinkedIn. You can find me at linkedin.com/in/Bethany Corbin, or you can reach out to me via email. It's Bethany@FemInnovation.com.
Awesome. Thank you guys so much for joining us for another episode of the Pretty Powerful Podcast, and we will see you next time. Thanks so much. Have a great day.
Thank you for joining our guests on the Pretty Powerful Podcast. And we hope you've gained new insight and learned from exceptional women. Remember to subscribe or check out this and all episodes on prettypowerfulpodcast.com. Visit us next time, and until then, step into your own power.